Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to do another series here on sound recording and talk about various aspects of sound recording that aren't usually brought up too often. Now, of course, initially I spoke about the early acoustic recordings and the trials and tribulations. I didn't go through all the activities of the recording studios. And of course, today, with our recording studios, they're very, very different. And I kind of talked about that in a second. Today, I want to talk about a number of individuals and the aspects and things that they did that influenced recording. Because the recording industry that exists today is something so different, so unique, and in many ways so artificial. That it pales in comparison to its earlier brethren, which was the early acoustic method of recording. You know, we have, since the beginning of electronics, tried to find ways of electrical recording. Now, the electronics age, if we really want to tear into it a little bit, we could say with the development of the telegraph, starting in 1844 was the beginnings of the electronics age. And you had instant communication, which was amazing. And of course, once that started, and if you think about the careers of Bell and Edison and others, all started to revolve around the telegraph. And the telegraph was very instrumental in the development of the phonograph, if we think about it. After the development of the phonograph, you had, in the 1890s, wire recording, but there was no way to amplify the recording on the wire recording, which the wire recordings were quite good, but there was no way to amplify, and sadly, there was no way to transfer that information onto a disc, at least at that time. When you think of great singers and performers, and as I've mentioned, they had to go from one end to the other without mistake, which is an interesting thing if you think about it. The more you look at the recording techniques of today, you look at those early recording artists with extremely admiration and saying, wow, you guys were really good. Now, of course, any performer who sings on a regular basis, performs on a regular basis, should, if they're competent, be able to go from one end of a song to the other. I mean, there's hardly a singer or performer or instrumentalist who can't do that. The problem is to make a stellar recording, something that will be a high mark of the art. There is where you run into problems. And that is the reason that the new technologies have been developed to create that stellar mode of recording. Now, recording changed drastically, as mentioned before, after World War II. I'm going to talk about a number of people who had effects on sound recording, some of whom I was able to talk to. Some of I've studied. Now, of course, Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison, of course, creates some very, very unique methods of recording. The dead studio, which was pretty remarkable if you think about it. And his idea was, at least in theory, was that the record itself would take on the acoustics of the room, rather than the acoustics of the room in which the recording was made to be the prime factor. Now today, that is no longer really an equation. We don't want the recording to take on the characteristics of the room in which it's played. You have the room resonance, the ambiance, the studio. That is all done. And of course, there is no desire for that recording to take on the acoustics of the room. That's a tired project at this point, although I will say that I think in the future someone will come up with something in regards of that, of having a way of taking a performance and have it take on the room resonance itself and be different in every place it's played. You had other individuals. You had Theodore Edison, who was very much involved in recording. Now, I was able to talk with Theodore a number of times, and we conversed on various subjects of recording. One thing he always said to me was, why do people want bass? They want bass, louder bass, bigger bass. He said it's not natural. It's not the way that sound is. And he said we have to make all these components with these huge speakers to create bass. Well, he realized that that would have to be done, and that's what they did do. And even so much as his Cinemusic system, which he told me about a little bit, which is somewhat sadly forgotten today, that he used signet horns, which were the first type of mathematically designed horn, and using mathematics, he could figure the places in the horn to put holes. So he knew where to have the best bass response. He realized he wasn't going to win, and so he accepted the situation. Now, his father, of course, was trying to find ways of enhancing sound and went so far as the 125-foot horn, which Theodore said that his father was going through books on mathematics and physics, which he didn't totally understand, and came to the theory that sound needed 125 feet to untangle itself. Therefore, he created a studio in which the artists were in one building, the recording devices were in the other, and that horn would allow them to record as most naturally as possible. Theodore said that his father was thinking perhaps of maybe like what would become the matched impedance system that was developed by Bell Labs, which led to the orthophonic playback system. But who knows? That's a long time ago. There's lots of other things that happened with recording and people that were involved with it. First off, we rarely think about the fact that how recording changed 100-fold after World War II, because tape was introduced. Now, I wanted to go into this a little bit because there's some fascinating things about this. In the United States during World War II, if someone was going to make a speech that was going to be broadcast on radio, they would make what was called an acetate recording. Now, an acetate recording would have a bit of noise. It was an inherent, it was a record. It was a needle going across a surface. So you're going to have noise. It's an inherent problem. What the Allies could not figure out during World War II was how Hitler, with the Nazis in Germany, was able to go all over the place and make speeches. Excuse me. Speeches that would at times last 20, 30 minutes. And there was no sound of the acetate. This is because the Germans, during World War II, had taken the idea of tape recording and made it a workable device. The reason why Adolf Hitler could do all of his speeches is that he recorded them in a studio on tape. He was the first tape recording artist, in a sense, if you think about it. Now, when the Allies got into Germany and they found these massive tape recorders, they were huge reels and stuff like that, they brought them back, and a few people became privy to them. One of them was Bing Crosby. And in conversation with Les Paul, I remember that Les Paul told me, he said that he got a phone call from Bing Crosby. And he said, Les, you got to come over and take a look at this. This is something totally different. It's incredible. Now, Les Paul had been involved in recording for many, many years. Of course, Les Paul's the inventor of the electric guitar, which he invented as a child. He was 15 years old, basically, when he did. He was working on a radio show. And he was going crazy because he was playing the guitar, an acoustic guitar, and his fingers were bleeding. And he brought in a pick, and that didn't work with the microphones. So, of course, he was home playing his phonograph, which was an early electric. You had a needle you'd screw into the reproducer. He looked at the reproducer, looked at the speaker, and he took the arm of the phonograph, broke it, took the needle, jammed it into his guitar, hit the guitar, and it played out through the speaker of the phonograph. This was the rudimentary beginnings of the electric guitar. And so he was very much involved in that beginnings of electronic music, electronic playback, electrically. And so he was extremely interested, and through looking at the tape, he developed a multi-track system. And this was the beginnings of the studio style of recording. You had multi-tracks. Now, Les Paul also told me something very interesting. He said before tape, it was a royal pain in the ass. He said because when you made a recording, and you had to have harmonies on the recording, you had to record the harmonies first, because you could not record the melody first, because the harmonies would override it. Kind of an interesting thing we don't think of. But that is how he did his early harmony recordings, was basically by recording all the parts over that groove. And of course, the weakest harmony he wanted would go first. And by the time you worked your way to the main melody, you had your harmonies behind you. But think of how many times one mistake was all over. That's why this whole thing with the tape that was developed by the Nazis and then taken and totally redeveloped by Les Paul and many others changed everything. Now, lots of other stuff happened. Once we got into the 1930s, we started to be able to enhance recording a little bit. We were able to add bass and treble and this, that, and other things. In fact, there's that old story about Leopold Stokowski, the conductor of the Philadelphia Symphony at the time, that they gave him dials so he could control the recording. Now, I honestly think that that's somewhat apocryphal in many respects. I talked to somebody who was involved in those recording sessions, and they said they had the dial set up, but the wires didn't connect to anything. I don't know how true that is. It's just something. I'm sure other people have heard this as well. Other things that come to mind, and that is that some singers started a career by taking multi-tracks and enhancing what they could do. You know, if you take your own voice and double track it, you change the voice totally. It becomes a much fuller, richer, fun thing, and it's good. It works rather well. I have done that in studios. When I was making some recordings, I was able to record, multi-tracks, and it was fantastic. And it made me sound, who was, like somewhat mediocre. All of a sudden, I sounded like a god. It was great. And that's the wonder of recording. Now, other things to mention. Let's do a few other things here. Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra was truly an artist when it came to his recordings because he would take many multiple takes and he would insert everything in place so it would fit the best. And he used to chide Dean Martin because Dean Martin was of the sort. He liked to start the song and sing through it. He didn't like to do retakes. He didn't like to change it around. And Frank Sinatra kept telling him, he said, your records won't sound as good. So, think about that. All of the recording artists from, let's say, 1949 on were recording on tape. They were recording on various tracks, and they could make their recordings sound fantastic. And that's very true. And then you have other things. You had stereo, which came out. And stereo, if you think about it, stereo works when you're close to it. But the further you get away from stereo, it turns back to mono. Because that's how it works. You had the Beatles stereo, which is interesting, on Capitol stereo. You had lots of other people that did all kinds of enhancement. And so if we go back to those original recordings, when they're singing through a horn, where there is nada when it comes to enhancement, that is the pure voice of the singer. Sans, quite often, the overtones. And we take it all the way to the present day. That Joe Schmo can sound fantastic on record. It's a fascinating thing. It's an interesting thing that we have done with recording. I just often think and wonder that perhaps we have maybe taken it a little too far. Because now we have auto-tune, and in fact singers sing with auto-tune as a matter of practice. Maybe we might start getting hybrid recordings where they might advertise it as no enhancements, no edits, a pure and total performance. And sadly, that's something that's long since been left out of the equation, but I can anticipate that eventually we might actually come to see that again, because people will want to hear exactly what a person sounds like. Not the idea of what that recording engineer, now you think about that recording engineer. Man, he takes people and changes things all around. I know a friend of mine was the concertmaster for the recordings for Stevie Wonder when he made a whole series of recordings in the 70s. And he said he wasn't even there. They made all the recordings by themselves. Stevie Wonder came in, made his recordings, and then the sound engineer mixed them all together. And if he was going too fast at a point, they'd slow it down. If they were going too fast at the orchestra, they just moved it faster. They made everything fit. But they never even saw each other. It's kind of interesting. And that is recording today. And digital recording is just like digital photography. You can change almost everything. And you can't really say that it is exactly what you see in a photograph digitally. And in many respects, you can't say it's exactly what you hear that was real in the sense of digital recording. There's so much more to talk about. There's so many people who influence this. I just touched a few people, but I see that my time is running short, and I will stop now. Hope you enjoy this. I hope you find this fascinating, and there again, as I said, I'm only talking about parts of this. I have a lot more I wish to speak of as time goes on, and share them with you. So, thank you very much.